Hi, I'm Janine TvsZ from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and that's in upstate New York. And I teach writing to mostly first-year students. And I'm going to give you a short and biased history of TvsZ. So the first game was in November 2012. Jesse Stommel and Pete Rarball came up with this game in preparation for a talk they were giving at Duke. About 160 people played the game, mostly educators, I think. And here are the two things I want to remember about the very first game. Is one, sort of this concept of emergent rules, that about every 12 hours new rules would come out and the game would change and get increasingly complex. More importantly than that, the rules were crowdsourced. There was a Google Doc where any player could go and suggest rules. The game was a pretty deliberate attempt to teach digital literacy. So at the beginning, you were learning how to use a hashtag and how to find the timestamp and like sort of the in and outs of using Twitter. But with each rule that came about, you'd maybe have to like use Storify or post a photo or make a video. So you were sort of learning these skills as you went along. The game was a really good way to build community, it turned out. That it was a very playful game. There was a lot of improvisation, a lot of room for the players to sort of make the game whatever they wanted to make it. One group of players who had become zombies, for example, decided they were nonviolent, and they came up with a zombie peace treaty that they put in a Google Doc. So the next game, TvsZ 2.0, happened in February of 2013. That one was a collaboration between my students in upstate New York and Pete Rarball's students in Georgia, who got together and formed communities and built a website and had a rules committee, things like that. The thing I want to remember from that game is that's where we made spirit of the game, the concept of spirit of the game, a part of the game. Something we borrowed from Ultimate Frisbee, but spirit of the game means that the game is self-officiated. Any of the players who are online at the time of any sort of dispute get to make the call. And spirit of the game puts it on the players, that it's the responsibility of all players to make sure that the game is fun and fair. The other thing I want to remember about that game is that there were the Rules Committee deliberately tried to increase the narrative possibilities. Particularly like hashtag safe zone. That meant that human players would come up with something like, we're on a train, we're in a hot air balloon, we're in the sewers of Paris. And for that hour, they would sort of spin this narrative about where they were. And I think those sort of narrative possibilities motivated players like me to stay human. So in September 2014, we see TvsZ 3.0. I think that's the game where we really see the emergence of experienced players. People had played the game all 3 times who were motivated to do things like come up with strategies and suggest rules. So that was the first game we actually had an hashtag antidote. We had a zombie who turned back to a human. That was a rule that people had been asking for, since the beginning. At that point, we had a whole body of past rules that the committee could sort of pick and choose from. So TvsZ 4.0, June of 2014. In this game, things changed even more. We at one point we added hashtag poem, and that is any player, human or zombie, could sort of just add a line of poetry to the game as just sort of a form of artistic expression. We also came up with hashtag chorus, and that meant any player, human or zombie, who wanted to gather up 10 lines of the poem and tweet them became a third species, sort of like a Greek chorus who sort of like watches the action but only sort of tells about it and doesn't participate. So that game really broke open some of the storytelling possibilities. I should mention TvsZ 5.0. That one, it wasn't a full-blown game. It was only 6 hours, led by a teacher in a classroom, and that was sort of an experiment in adding course content to the game. For example, you had to write a blog post about why feminism was important. The thing I remember about that game is that we had really articulate zombies, who were spouting feminist theory as they bit people. But that game, too, is one of the ones that really made me question the zombie narrative. It didn't really mesh well with the course content in that case. So that brings us to November of 2014. A sort of a group of us from sort of pretty much all over the world were the administrators for that game. So 6.0, 2 years after the original game, we ran a TvsZ without zombies. And as I mentioned, it was a pretty international game. We had Mahabali in Egypt. We had people in Canada. I had students in New York. I know there were students in Georgia, California. So we began the game with the team's nature and technology, which we had thought would be sort of maybe an interesting dichotomy. I know my students very early in the game invoked the spirit of the game and formed their own teams. I think Team Fish was the first one, and then Team Dragon. So instead, we no longer had zombies biting humans, but we had like these dragon bovines who were hoarding gold and chewing cud. And so it was more imaginative, I think, this game. This was a game in which missions became more important than the rules. We had a hashtag folklore mission and a hashtag manifesto. So missions in which the players were sort of doing things rather than avoiding getting bitten. And that's the history of TvsZ so far.